One of the most commonly shared human experiences, apart from yelling into a fan as a kid to make yourself sound like a robot, is the feeling of being sad for no reason. It could happen right when you wake up or slowly onset as the sun goes down, but no matter the time, the experience is still the same. You get this lingering sense that life has no real rhyme or reason to it, and everything positive you've been doing up until this point suddenly no longer carries the same weight of significance. When you get sad for no reason, you might have the urge to isolate and distract yourself from these intrusive thoughts through mindless stimulation. And in doing so, this coping mechanism may actually provide the relief that you need until the feeling inevitably passes. But what if that feeling starts to overstay its welcome? What if several days pass by, and even through the acts of forcing yourself outside, committing to healthy habits, and unplugging from stimulation, you still have this overwhelming nihilistic urge to stay stuck in the unhappiness? This phenomenon of almost desiring to be sad has most likely been around forever, but it's only recently risen in its romanticization in the past decade or so. So today, I'd like to explore this new rise in mental illness, the effects of sharing our negative experiences online, and why many young people seem to love getting addicted to the idea of being sad. Since the beginning of our existence, humans have been trying to explain and express the occasional but ever-present torment that stays knocking on our brain's door. Before modern science's ability to inspect the body, analyze patterns, and give firm solutions to our symptoms, one of the best ways of dealing with the more negative aspects of life was through media representation. Several hundred years ago, playwrights such as Shakespeare and poets such as Edgar Allan Poe used their respective type of media to try and formulate their mental distress that they either observed or went through themselves. And while I'm sure they decided to embark on these creative endeavors because they genuinely enjoyed them, I can only imagine that this output almost came as a necessity to understand what the hell was going on with them. Shakespeare's son died from what is thought to be of the bubonic plague at the age of just 11 years old, and it's been speculated that a few of his works might have been inspired by his agony. For example, in Shakespeare's play King Lear, when Lear recognizes his daughter is dead, he says, "No, no, no, life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou'lt come no more. Never, 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 never." This could draw similarities to what Shakespeare might have been feeling during the time of his son's death, and he wanted to express that through his creative work. By the same token, Edgar Allan Poe wrote the poem Alone after his beloved foster mother died in 1829 as a way to put into words just how lonely he must have felt. While it can be argued that these tragic poems and plays were attempting to aestheticize depression and grief, I don't think that's what the intention of the creators were at all. And because of that, people were not reading these poems or watching these plays thinking they'd come out of it with a better understanding of their traumas. They were mostly engaging with these forms of media simply just to be moved by them in some way, whether that form of movement be entertainment, sadness, or joy. And this is going to be important to understand when we start to compare the media during this time to the media we consume now. Speaking of the media that we consume, I'm going to go over a little later in this video how videos and memes are shaping the way we perceive mental illnesses. And although that's brought a lot of pros and cons, I think it's definitely a pro that we now have access to so many creative online tools at our disposal. And that is why I am very excited to share with you guys the sponsor of today's video, Canva. Canva is an all-in-one creative platform that I've been using since I first started my online business. In fact, my very first ever ebook was designed using Canva all the way back in 2018. There are a ton of great features that I've been using in Canva for years now, like the ability to choose from different templates and layouts. These take out a lot of the hassle you would usually feel when trying to make your ebooks, posters, or other visual design work aesthetically pleasing, and give you a good basis with which to flex your own creativity on. They also have their new Draw feature, which allows you to sketch out your creative ideas, underline, annotate, and turn your different drawn shapes into perfect polished versions of them. And something that I've been using recently, especially on my thumbnails, is their photo editor. I can upload photos and remove distractions by brushing over them, describe things I want to add and watch them magically appear, or remove the background of an image entirely with the click of a button, which saves me loads of time. Canva is easily one of the best creative apps that I've used and will continue to use, and if you are trying to do any type of design work, whether that be for your business or just as a hobby, this is the app to do it with. If you're interested in trying out Canva yourself, all you gotta do is click the first link in the description box below, so go check it out. Canva is the best. Now, let's get back to the video. During the time of Shakespeare and Poe, and the couple hundred years that followed it, there was still a lot of stigma surrounding mental illness. If you had what we now refer to as conditions such as schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, or some other serious mental health problem, you were seen as either insane or just plain weak. Because even the most extreme of mental illnesses often do not manifest themselves in physical ways. They're much more deceptive. And because of that, the people who don't understand these illnesses find them a lot less believable than something physical. But starting around the mid to late 20th century, there was a big push in the West to start to destigmatize mental illness. This was done not only so we could better understand the causes and develop better treatments, but also to help those who are mentally well empathize and understand with those who are mentally struggling. And what better way to attempt to demonstrate realistic and humanized versions of mental illness than in one of the most influential pieces of pop culture at the time: film. Film has always done a pretty good job at representing the trends of current society, but in a dramatized way. So the challenge for filmmakers during this time was that they had to combine their inclination to stretch the truth with portraying mental illness in a pragmatic way. Perhaps the most famous depiction of mental illness in 90s film was the psychological thriller Silence of the Lambs, starring Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster. In the film, one of the main characters, Hannibal Lecter, is portrayed as a psychopath with superior intellect and, dare I say, charm. And due to the popularity of this movie, the average person actually started to associate psychopathy with intelligence and charm. But studies have shown that this association is far from reality. In a paper titled The Hannibal Lecter Myth, which was conducted due to the impact of the film, it was concluded that there is actually an inverse relationship between verbal intelligence and psychopathy, meaning that psychopaths are usually the exact opposite of what was portrayed in Anthony Hopkins' role. This is important because film doesn't just represent trends like I stated earlier, it also influences trends and the way we think and interact with our environment, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. So whether the director was intentionally trying to do this or not, this film and others like it during this time did in a way glamorize being a psychopath. But it certainly has not stopped there. If anything, glamorizing psychopathy, depression, and now even being a serial killer is only more prominent in TV shows and films than it was back then. Shows like 13 Reasons Why, Dahmer, or American Horror Story portray characters with severe psychological problems as having this sort of misunderstood enchantment to them, making the viewer become reeled into the idea of having a mental illness. In fact, there was even a study done that showed the amount of unalives of people aged 10 to 17 increased significantly after the release of the first season of 13 Reasons Why. Now, I will say there is a lot of speculation as to whether this season really did cause this, or if it's just a correlation, and I'm skeptical on these stats as well. The study may not have been done in the most proper manner, and another study was done after the release of the second season, which showed that unaliving actually went down in young teenagers if they finished that second season. Maybe the writing and portrayal was different between the first and second season. To be honest, I haven't actually watched the show, but regardless, I think it highlights just how important it is to consider how these types of shows can affect young teenagers in particular. But why does this big influence of film and TV shows on the perception of mental illness seem to impact young teenagers the most, apart from the obvious fact that teenagers are much more impressionable and believe more of what is portrayed in the media? Well, I think my relationship with the TV show Dexter as a young teenager can help to provide us with some insight. Back when I was around 12 or 13, I didn't really have much of a personality with which I could characterize myself in the world, and I never saw myself as someone who was normal and could fit in. The reality was that I was in fact pretty normal, but I almost didn't want to be. I felt like I was looking at society from the outside in, and no one really understood my subjective problems. But then I started to watch Dexter, which is a TV show about a serial killer that kills serial killers, and all of this started to change. This show has a very interesting way of getting you to side with this dude who does very bad things to other people. But that's not the part of Dexter that I was focused on, so you can relax now. I don't identify, and I've never identified with that part of him. I was more so attracted to the way the show glamorized his isolated and misunderstood life.
I don't know what made me the way I am, but whatever it was left a hollow place inside.
And so I remember starting to adopt some of the characteristics of the main character, but without the whole needing to kill people part. I pictured myself as this lone, mysterious wolf whom nobody understood, who blended in with the rest of society, but was really an outcast with inconspicuous psychological problems. And I started to say to myself, I can relate to Dexter. He's kinda like me. He's literally me. If you don't understand where I'm getting at with this, let me explain to you the fairly new trend of literally me characters. In TV shows and films, directors and writers do their best at creating characters that the audience can relate to, that actually feel human. And many shows and movies do a great job at this, so much so to the point where the audience starts to see parts of themselves in the character, or at the most extreme, see themselves as the character. Eventually, memes started popping up on places like Facebook in 2018, where someone would post a quote of a character or just a picture of them with the caption, "They are literally me," or "He's just like me for real." And when this really started to pick up steam, common themes between these characters became apparent. The average male characters often exhibit discontentment with society, struggles with mental health, and an inability to fit in, while the average female characters often dressed alternatively, suffered from traumatic experiences, and isolated themselves from others. When you really examine these characters, the problem with young teenagers identifying with them becomes very clear. Characters like Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, and Arthur Fleck in Joker all feature a protagonist who takes the lives of others as an expression of their discontentment with modern society, and often portray characteristics of narcissism, paranoia, and depression. On the surface, this might seem pretty harmless. After all, when I was saying literally me about Dexter, it never had me wanting to do the really severe, terrible things that Dexter did in the show, and all things considered, I think I turned out pretty alright. The evidence that violence in media leads more people to want to commit those violent acts in real life is slim. But some interesting research has been done to show exactly how the brain areas associated with our sense of self react to seeing our favorite characters on screen. In 2021, a study was conducted by Ohio State University to see how our brain connected to fictional characters, particularly with the Game of Thrones series. And they found that the activity in the part of the brain that relates to our sense of self saw a substantial increase when the participants' favorite character was on screen. This suggests that people incorporate these characters into their self-concept, whether they are consciously aware of it or not. So how does this lead to the romanticization of depression? Well, for one, even though it seems like a lot of these literally me posts are actually just a joke, are sometimes used as a harmless coping mechanism, and many people don't actually see themselves as Patrick Bateman or the Joker, you have to wonder how much of these memes, which are now even expanding into fancy romanticized edits, are making young kids want to adopt the personality traits of the characters as a way to feel different and cool. Kind of like how I did with Dexter back in 2010. Perhaps these kids have never considered themselves to be anything like these characters before they saw the movies or clips of the movies, but once they saw how big the literally me/Sigma community was, and how it was being romanticized through edits and memes glorifying these characters, they wanted to join this community of outcasts all being miserable together. And in this way, many of these people could try and create or exacerbate the problems that all young teenagers have, like not being taken seriously, feeling lonely, confused, and depressed, as a way to finally fit in with a group or feel like the main character of their own tragic life. It is important, however, to criticize the society that made these characters relevant in the first place. Literally me characters don't just come about due to angsty teens who do not yet know their place in the world. They are a reflection of how much of the youth population feels about society as a whole. Our ability to share almost every experience with our peers in the online realm has brought on a new medium of representation for depression and other mental illnesses. No longer are we forced to formulate our opinions on mental illnesses that we do not understand based on how popular media sources portray them. Now we can get more insight into the day-to-day lives of people who really struggle with these things on a regular basis. This has undoubtedly brought a lot of pros to the world. There's no longer such a taboo on things like depression because there's much more of an understanding that quite literally everyone goes through some form of sadness, despite the type of appearance most people give off in their everyday lives. People are much more willing to seek help and get treatment than they were just a few decades ago. And perhaps the most positive influence of this rise of sharing our negative experiences online is the feeling of knowing you are not alone. This is what built the foundation of my channel here on YouTube. When I started sharing stories of my past and all the shit I did and went through and what I learned from it, that sense of real relatability connected with tons of young people and made them realize, oh, so I'm not the only one that's going through this. And when people realize they aren't the only one going through it, not only does that send off signals in the brain that lead to an improved mood, but it also makes you realize, well, this person got through it, so that means I might be able to get through it too. But unfortunately, Similarly, when you give any person unrestricted access to their phones and the ability to reach millions of people within minutes, that does not mean that things like depression won't become skewed. As we explored earlier, many young people can adopt personalities and character traits of these literally me characters, even if they didn't relate to these characters prior to learning about them. But they can also start to believe that they might have symptoms of mental illnesses even when they previously showed little to no signs of having them. This is something I briefly went over in my Why Is Everybody Depressed video, where I showed articles that exemplified how some teens that consume TikToks were self-diagnosing their autism, borderline personality disorder, and depression. If you get too caught in these internet echo chambers and you don't have a firm grasp over the difference between temporary, universal human feelings versus actual symptoms of these illnesses, you can start to convince yourself that something is wrong with you. And especially as a young teenager whose mind has a less adept ability to filter the information that they consume, this can become very powerful. Pretty soon, you could find those temporary sad feelings developing into something more serious if you let yourself be eaten by the algorithms on social media. Looking back on my experience as a kid, I could definitely see myself almost getting addicted to the idea of being sad. In fact, I feel like I've done that just within the past few years. Because there is certainly beauty in suffering, especially with the way it's portrayed on social media. When artists use their creativity to express their negative emotions through their work, it can resonate with a lot of people online who are struggling with the same thing. And in many cases, it can be just the thing that someone needs in order to cope with what they are currently going through until they eventually garner the strength to come out of it. But regardless of that, I still often see many people staying there and getting lost in the beauty and aesthetic behind depression. Without suffering, sadness, and depression, it can be very hard to feel like your life has any meaning. And without drama, tension, and sadness in films and TV shows, there isn't enough compelling content to consider watching it. These more negative aspects of life certainly have an alluring aesthetic to them, and now users on apps like TikTok and Instagram Reels have been capitalizing on our natural tendency to be drawn to the negative. Of course, this has been done for thousands of years through various forms of entertainment, like I explained earlier in the video. But the content which is created on these platforms is different because of the intention behind it. The intention behind a lot of these creators is to make mental illness look like this tragically beautiful act that makes you different and unique, and that could either make you adopt it as a personality trait or only confirm to you that your suffering is where you need to stay because you are nothing without it. This is a pretty common phenomenon that I've seen through reading stories on the internet, that people genuinely believe that they are nothing without their traumas and insecurities and depression, and that they don't deserve to be happy. And these are the people that are most susceptible to the type of experiences that I just described. While watching a video by the YouTuber Ali Sunvia about the desire to be sad, I was intrigued by this comment. I was terribly depressed in high school and in a relationship that absolutely kept me in that rut. I began feeling better when I left that relationship, and I began to feel lost. For years, I held on to that sadness that characterized me because I thought to myself, what or who am I without my sadness? It felt like my personality. I was the manic pixie dream girl with a beautifully tragic backstory, and seeking help / getting better meant losing the edge and quirk that mental illness gave you back then. I eventually sought professional help, and thanks to that, I was able to discover who I really was without the heavy blanket of depression over me at all times. I wish I could tell my younger self to not fear the uncertainty that comes with looking for help. I can relate to this story at least a little bit myself as well, and was under the impression that I needed and wanted these parts of me just not too long ago. I remember a couple years back when I had moved to Vegas with a few of my friends to pursue being a YouTuber full time, there was a period of time where I had one of those random bouts of sadness. And to deal with that loneliness and confusion I felt, I would listen to a lot of Joji, whose songs offer a very melancholic tone to them. There was definitely a part of that music that I think helped me work through what I was going through and kind of let me feel those negative emotions without suppressing or avoiding them, but I also think towards the end of that era, I was starting to really get addicted to that feeling of having some sort of problem and sadness. This didn't really make sense to me. Why did it feel like I wanted to have some sort of problems and actively torment myself? Well, after enough life experience and my own research, I found that our brain really likes to create problems even when they aren't there. An experiment was done by the BBC which showed a real-world example of this. What they did was bring in volunteers to look at a series of computer-generated faces and decide which ones seemed the most threatening. And funnily enough, when the participants ran out of threatening faces to find, they started calling faces that they used to call harmless in the first part of the experiment threatening. This makes sense from a survival standpoint. Our brains are wired to look for danger in our environment in order to keep us safe, even if the danger isn't really there. And in the same way, when life feels really comfortable and your needs are satisfied, your brain can actually start to manufacture problems for you as a way to let you know you are alive and surviving. Perhaps that's what happened to me in Vegas, or maybe there was something that was genuinely wrong that I needed to change. Either way, it's clear to me that we can often exacerbate our problems by allowing them to be intensified through the media we consume and get stuck there because it really does make us feel something, whether that something is good or not. This new wave of aestheticizing and romanticizing depression comes with a host of problems that I think we still don't understand the repercussions of. And while speaking up about your problems and actually getting help for them has been destigmatized quite a bit, there is still an ongoing mix-up between destigmatization and romanticization. The goal of creators and consumers should be one of mutual understanding, of realizing that you are not alone in your struggle and that getting help if you need it is a great option. It should not be that depression is some sort of personality trait that you hold on to and wear as if that's the only thing that makes you, you. Because you are so much more than whatever you have been labeled as having. Hopefully, as time goes by, this destigmatization and better representation of just how awful it can be to deal with these mental illnesses continues to rise, but without its inaccurate, glorified, man-made counterpart getting looped into it. For some people, actually most people I would argue, the very thing that they need to hear is that it's okay to not be okay. But for others, the one thing that they need to hear is that it's okay to be okay. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and opinions on this subject. It always helps me form a better view of things, so if you want to share that, leave it in the comments below. Would love to hear about it. And thank you to all my patrons on Patreon. If you don't know what Patreon is, it's a platform separate from YouTube where I put out exclusive content. If you want to check that out, the link is in the description. And if you enjoy watching video essays on modern issues, I have a whole playlist of them here. I've made quite a few so far. They're pretty fun to make, so if you want to check those out and get some more insight into modern problems from me, then yeah, click on that thing. And thanks for watching till the end. Peace.